let's say over 10 years, we pledged to buy 50 billion a year from the Americans in military kit to support Ukraine. And you could call it the Trump Defense of Democracy Fund, whatever. He likes those kind of labels. Give him the credit for it. And I don't think Trump could say no to that. I mean, that's a huge number of jobs assured in the US. And I think, that would ensure Ukraine's the provision of military equipment to Ukraine to be able to defend themselves. It would buy us time. It would buy the Ukrainians time. It would give Trump the kind of win. And again, I've been on your program before and I've ranted on about it. We've still got these immobilized Russian assets in our banking systems, right? Why the hell aren't our governments seizing them? That's Russian taxpayer money, seizing them and using it to fund our own defense and actually the defense of Ukraine.
Hello and welcome to the Trump Report. I'm Louis Sykes. Today we're joined by economist Timothy Ash. He is an associate fellow in the Russia and Eurasia programme at Chatham House and a senior sovereign strategist at RBC Blue Bay Asset Management in London. Tim, welcome.
My pleasure.
President Zelensky is meeting Trump in the White House today to sign this minerals deal. But this is a very different deal to the one that was put to Kiev in the previous weeks, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, look, the Ukrainians, I think, initiated this whole kind of process, this idea of this $12 trillion worth of minerals to kind of, I guess, entice the Trump administration to commit a bit more in terms of its support for Ukraine. They kind of lured them in. And then I think the narrative was kind of taken away from them a bit, where the Trump administration, I mean, there's no real, it's hard to describe it other than trying to fleece the Ukrainians. I mean, it's been mentioned as Ben Wallace, former defense secretary, is talking about extortion. I mean, the deal proposed, I think, by the Trump administration that they went to Kiev was a terrible deal for Ukraine, really. I mean, it gave the Americans half of everything, more or less, without putting the Americans on the hook for anything in particular. I mean, there was no real commitment there in terms of financing or security. And there was questions whether it was really enforceable in law, right? So the Ukrainians, I think, were shocked, didn't feel able to sign away, their forever wealth of the country. And then they spent the last couple of weeks figuring out how to row back from it a bit, but keep, don't annoy Trump. And obviously, not signing it did annoy Trump. I mean, obviously, he called Zelensky a dictator, etc. I think that they've got a script now that they feel a bit more comfortable with. Unfortunately, there's nothing in there, really, in terms of commitment still from the Americans, right? Trump's going on about, so there's no security guarantees, there's no real commitment in terms of financing. Trump goes on about the fact that the mere fact that American companies might be on the ground in Ukraine is security enough. I mean, a reality is I don't think anyone would take that as a security guarantee. But anyway, for Zelensky, they've kind of stabilized the rhetoric with the Trump administration, and he gets a session in the White House to kind of agree on this deal. Like Starmer, he'll get a bit of quality time with Trump, be able to kind of reinforce what the Ukrainians want, maybe better understand also the Trump administration. I mean, if in the reality, the Trump administration just wants to sell Ukraine down the river, it's probably good that Zelensky knows that and hears it from, the horse's mouth himself, and then can move on and do something else. So we are where we are. This is not a landmark deal. No one is going to invest in Ukraine until it's secure. So the Ukrainians are absolutely right. There's no point having a ceasefire. There's no point having a peace deal unless they have some kind of security, right? That's absolutely critical, whether it's NATO membership, whether it's bilateral security guarantees, or it's just a commitment that the West will provide Ukraine with whatever level of conventional military kit that they can defend themselves. I mean, I would argue that's probably the most realistic and effective, because they've proven able to fight the Russians. We just haven't supplied them with enough finance and military equipment to let them do the job themselves.
And does this deal really say that much? I mean, does it even say anything about who gets these minerals, or is it just dealing with the profits here?
Well, it talks about, setting up like a sovereign wealth company that's part owned by the Ukrainians and the Americans. I mean, it's very vague. It's basically just a general heads up in terms of broad-based, commitment. Not commitment's the wrong word, actually. a framework agreement that they'd like to work together in the future, really, right? I mean, there's nothing else. There's no real commitment on either side, frankly.
And they've billed it in a way as being a reconstruction investment fund. Will there be a kind of economic benefit for Ukraine, or is this just this sort of repayment that Trump has demanded from Kiev?
Well, Trump likes big shiny deals with his name on it, right? And that's what it's, I mean, he can talk about whatever $1 trillion deal or whatever it is, right? I mean, he likes that kind of thing. Look, I mean, they talk about, creating a sovereign wealth fund, again, jointly owned by the Americans and the Ukrainians, which will reinvest in Ukrainian reconstruction. That's all well and good. But to get these minerals out of the earth, that US companies and others will have to invest in fixed assets in Ukraine, and they're not secure as long as the Russians, may well go and bomb everything still. So there needs to be, a minimum level of security for any investments in any of this stuff. And frankly, at the moment, those security guarantees are just not there. And Trump himself said with us in the start of the meeting, the Americans are basically not prepared to provide those specific security guarantees. That's, Trump's not very big on detail, right? He likes the glory of sitting down and penning a deal with his Sharpie, but it's for others to sort out the detail. And I think here it's for the Europeans to sort out the detail and clear up the mess. He's interested in the big prize, the Nobel Prize, a ceasefire deal. He doesn't really care what happens after the initial signing of the deal. And the difficulty here is, the devil's in the detail, right? I mean, if this was so easy to have been worked out, it would have been worked out in 2015, if you remember. Well, 2014 and 2015, annexation of Crimea, Minsk 1, Minsk 2. It's complicated. It's really complicated. And it's got more difficult and complicated. And I don't think Trump can just swan in here and impose some kind of ceasefire without really understanding the core issues. And frankly, I just don't think he does.
Yeah. How crucial are those rare earth minerals to the US economy?
Well, firstly, look, I've covered Ukraine for 40 years, right? I've lived in Ukraine. And I have to say, and I'm an economist, right? It's my kind of job. It's the first time in 40 years I ever heard of Ukraine having $11 trillion worth of rare earths. I mean, this is a $200 billion economy, right? So they've been hiding them really well. And, I mean, look, if obviously now, the US is in competition with China in terms of global economic hegemony. There is certainly a battle for rare earths. And if there are any in Ukraine, then, that's obviously an advantage to the Americans to get hold of them. Look, I think there are so many question marks around, whether or not Ukraine has any of this stuff, whether it's commercially viable to get it out, again, whether you can frame the security arrangement around it, that private industry, and it is going to be private industry and investment that's going to get this stuff out, whether they'll feel comfortable putting money to work in Ukraine to deliver, some of these rare earths. So, I mean, loads and loads of question marks, right?
And do you think it really makes a difference to Trump or Washington if they're buying those resources from Putin or Zelensky? Because Putin has said he is willing to supply them himself. I mean, Russia surely does have a lot of these rare earth minerals, does it?
Well, yes, I think they probably do. I mean, and there has been a bit of a battle behind the scenes between the Russians and the Ukrainians, to entice Trump into some kind of big deal. I mean, look, it's been so extraordinary the first couple of months of the Trump presidency, and this pivot away from Europe, pivot away from NATO towards Russia. I mean, I do think, I'm not sure Trump himself, but I think people in the Trump administration see it from a hegemonic battle with China kind of gig, and this reverse Nixonian, right? So your ultimate battle is with China. We need to make friends with Russia to undermine China. I mean, I do think that is part of the thinking of people like Steve Bannon and Navarro and Tucker Carlson. Not sure Trump himself necessarily thinks that. And Russia, would love, Putin loves stirring things up. Unfortunately with Trump, he's achieved an enormous amount in 2 months. I mean, it's extraordinary post-Munich Security Council that, NATO is in massive trouble. I mean, that's the reality, right? I mean, we all thought Putin's invasion of Ukraine had, Macron questioned. He suggested NATO was brain dead, and then the Ukraine war happened, and then suddenly it had a purpose again. And I think within a couple of weeks, I think now, NATO's future is seriously in doubt, right? I mean, I think Europe is questioning whether the US security backstop for Europe is still there. I don't think it is, right? And I think we all have to move on. But this is just extraordinary stuff, right? The US could be dumping Europe, its long-standing allies, and Ukraine, which is fighting for democracy and fighting the defense of Europe, for Russia, a dictatorship, and there's no other way to describe it, that has been doing bad stuff against us. I mean, just think, Russia has deployed weapons of mass destruction twice on NATO soil already. In the UK, Litvinenko and Salisbury, right? I mean, and yet the Americans seem to have forgotten about all that, and they're quite happy now to get into bed with the Russians against the Chinese. Anyway, it's all extraordinary stuff, right?
Well, in perhaps a more reassuring sign for Europe, Trump has extended US sanctions on Russia into 2026. Do you think Russia can withstand more American sanctions until then?
Well, I mean, extended them. He can take them off whenever he wants, right? I mean, he can dial them up, dial them down. I think Trump, I think, would take sanctions off Russia if he thought it would get that shiny deal that he wants, and that would create huge question marks, to be honest, for us in Europe. What do? We have our own. UK has our own sanctions regime. Europe has its own sanctions regime. I was just actually talking to a banker from a US bank, and I was asking him what happens if the US takes sanctions off. Would you be trading Russian securities? And he said, well, yeah, because we're an American bank. I said, well, what happens if the UK keeps them in place? I mean, this bank has a significant operation in the UK and Europe. I mean, it would have to comply with UK sanctions. So it will get very, very messy. Sanctions moderation. I mean, there's been a lot of criticism of sanctions, right? And they haven't been as effective as perhaps they could have been. We could have done more. We should have done more. But there is evidence now, there has been evidence that they were beginning to work, right? Inflation in Russia is a problem. Russia's having to make more difficult choices. Its buffers have been worn down. It's a sad if, just at that point where there's light at the end of the tunnel in terms of imposing real cost on Russia, Trump comes along and takes them all off, right? I mean, people. I mean, my point has been in terms of the ceasefire negotiations is Trump actually has a very strong negotiating position, right? He can increase sanctions, he can increase military supplies to Ukraine. He has lots of things to negotiate around: NATO membership, bilateral security guarantees, sanctions. Unfortunately, he's given Putin everything he wants before the negotiations have even started, right? Talk of sanctions moderation, talk of limiting military supplies to Ukrainians, saying Putin keeps all the territory he's got at the moment and no NATO and no security guarantee from the US, right? So Putin, Freudian slip there in talking about Trump rather than Putin. Putin must think it's manna from heaven. He's got everything he wants before he's even started, and now he's gone back to his maximalist demands. He's going on about denazification of Ukraine, demilitarization of Ukraine. And the demilitarization is the important one. I mean, basically, Putin, what that means is Putin wants to set limitations on Ukraine's military capability, right? That's Ukraine's ability to defend itself. I mean, it's a green light for Putin to go in again. Now, the question obviously does Trump understand this? Does he get what Putin's trying to do? I just don't think so, right? It looks very amateurish. And I fear that Ukraine will be sold a very bad deal. And in the end, they'll decide, actually, we can't accept this deal.
And, if Trump does lift sanctions and the EU keeps theirs in place, does that give Russia that space to recover and rearm his military if he does want to take a second go? And how quickly could he do that in that situation?
Look, I think Europe's realised that Russia is the existential threat to Europe, right? So whatever happens in Ukraine, Europe has an interest in keeping sanctions on Russia in place to weaken the Russian economy, to not to make it that Russia can't regenerate its conventional military capability. If the Americans go and lift sanctions, they're undermining that effort. They're undermining European security by doing that. And, we've seen more generally that there are plenty of players and countries that do want to circumvent sanctions and help Russia break them. But, the Americans would just be adding to that, making a quick buck at the expense of Europe. It's sad. But, this Trump administration is all about making a quick buck, I think.
And should Trump not be using those sanctions as a kind of bargaining chip with Russia? I mean, it to some it might seem like Trump's kind of trademark unpredictability. He lays out that yes, sanctions are on the table. Then suddenly a week later, he's extended these sanctions for a year. Should there not be a level of back and forth, or maybe even a rug pull that Trump tries to deploy against the Russians in negotiations?
Look, I mean, Trump's unpredictability can be an advantage in negotiations, right? But I think, if you look at what's happened so far in a month and a half in office around the discussions with the Russians, I think giving away things like, the territory, NATO membership, security guarantees, you weaken your hand. These are things you should be, negotiating very hard on. It's meant that the whole debate has moved east towards Russia. We are now debating denazification. I mean, Ukraine is not a Nazi state, right? It's a democracy. It has had more elected presidents than Russia. There are no political prisoners in jail. They don't get killed in Ukraine. They get killed in Russia. Denazification is Russia demands a change of government in Kiev to his favor, right? One that is going to follow his script. And the demilitarization is, again, about this idea of limiting Ukraine's military capability. Unfortunately, the debate has moved from, which we should have starting about NATO membership, and then had a compromise somewhere in the middle. Unfortunately, it's moved completely east to we're now talking about demilitarization. And remember, if in the end Ukraine has limitations on its military capability, Putin will invade again, because that's what he does, right?
And do you think this? I mean, Trump is repeatedly saying he wants European peacekeepers, whatever that might actually mean, to go into Ukraine. Is that reassuring at all? Do you think for Kiev?
Look, I mean, we know the stark reality. The only countries that have suggested they're willing to do it is the UK, maybe France, right? The UK lacks the military capability. We don't have enough soldiers, right? I mean, it's a huge ceasefire line. How many troops could we deploy? It doesn't work, unfortunately, without some US backstop. That's the harsh reality. And what happens if Russia attacks? What is the UK going to do then, right? I mean, if it's going to be a peacekeeping reassurance force, it needs to have a very robust mandate with a strong backstop from someone, right? And we simply don't have that at the moment. So I don't see that's particular reassurance for Ukraine. As I said before, I think the strongest security guarantee would be giving the Ukrainians the tools to defend themselves. For 3 years, I mean, against overwhelming odds, for 3 years they stood up to a superpower, Russia, that everyone expected to be over in 2 weeks. 3 years later, why is that? Because Ukrainians themselves, we've provided some kit and some financing, but it's been the Ukrainians' willingness and ability to stand up to the Russians, innovate, all those kind of things. So give them more tools and financing to let them do their job. And in the end, Europe is clearly not in a position to defend itself at the moment from Russian aggression. With years of underinvestment in defence and spending the peace dividend. Our best chance to get a bit of time to rebuild our defences is if the Ukrainians hold out longer, right? I mean, that's the harsh reality. So the more durability we give the Ukrainians, the better positioned we are to defend ourselves over the longer term.
Well, in that light, last week we heard about this 20.9 billion aid package for Ukraine from the European Union. Is that going to help plug the potential slowdown for US aid, or is that more just, eking it out for Ukraine so they don't lose but can't get a sort of crushing defeat against Putin?
Yeah, I mean, at the moment, it's not really financing. The numbers are very doable, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it costs about 100 billion a year for Ukraine to to defend Ukraine. It's probably about 150 billion a year for them to be put on the front foot. Europe is a $27 trillion economy, right? I mean, we should be more than able to provide 100 to 150 billion a year. I mean, we're talking about going from 2% of GDP NATO defense spend to 3%. Now, for Europe, each 1 percentage point increase is 250 billion euros. So think of the maths here. You can give the Ukrainians 100 or 150 billion a year to win the war, or we end up spending at least an extra 250 billion a year forever. I mean, it's a no-brainer, right? I mean, if we have any sense at all in Europe, we should be making sure we give the Ukrainians, the finance and the military kit to defend themselves. Now, the issue is the military kit angle, in that we simply lack the arsenal that the Americans have, right? I mean, in the end, they're the guys who give Patriot missiles, HIMARS, and all these kind of things. They have the stockpiles. We don't. Eventually we will. Eventually Europe will rebuild its military-industrial complex. Well, probably in 5 years. That's too late for the Ukrainians. Now, what we should be doing as Europe, and actually this is far more useful, I think, than the mineral deal, if you want to hook Trump into supporting Ukraine. If I was a clever European or a Brit, I think we may be still in Europe, kind of physically, right? Maybe not politically, but anyway. What I would do is I would put together a big military procurement package. Let's say 500 billion a year, and I would pitch to the Americans. Sorry, not 500 billion a year. I would say 500 billion. Let's say over 10 years. We pledged to buy 50 billion a year from the Americans in military kit to support Ukraine. And you could call it the Trump Defense of Democracy Fund, whatever. He likes those kind of labels. Give him the credit for it. And I don't think Trump could say no to that. I mean, that's a huge number of jobs assured in the US. And I think, that would ensure Ukraine's the provision of military equipment to Ukraine to be able to defend themselves. It would buy us time. It would buy the Ukrainians time. It would give Trump the kind of win. And again, I've been on your program before and I've ranted on about it. We've still got these immobilized Russian assets in our banking systems, right? Why the hell aren't our governments seizing them? That's Russian taxpayer money, seizing them and using it to fund our own defense and actually the defense of Ukraine. Interestingly, this week, I mean, obviously in the UK, in the House of Commons, Prime Minister Starmer came out with the announcement about going to 2.5% of GDP defence spend and using the aid budget to fund it. We have something like 25 billion quid of Russian central bank money in our jurisdiction. If we want to moonshot our own defence spend in the UK, we should confiscate that Russian money and use it for our own defence spending. 25 billion, it's about a third of current UK defence spending. It would enable us. It would enable us to add, half percentage point onto our own defence spend, and we could use a lot of that for helping the Ukrainians. I mean, why aren't we doing that? The legal basis for it is established. It's a political decision. So I just would wish European and British politicians would think a little bit more strategically and outside the box, and recognise that Russia is an existential threat to European security, and we need to do whatever it takes to ensure our defence, which is ensuring the Ukrainians' defence. And there is money there. It's not the money; it's getting the weaponry, and you can get the Americans to provide it if you package the message, package a program and message it in the right way.
And just finally, Timothy, we are about half an hour away from Zelensky speaking alongside Donald Trump at the White House today. What will you be looking out for in that, and what should people be looking out for in that Ukraine will be seeking to get?
Well, it's specifics in terms of security guarantees. What is the US willing to continue to provide Ukraine with arms, right, to be able to defend itself? Is there any specific security backstop to this reassurance force that the UK and France perhaps are willing to put on the ground? I mean, seemingly yesterday with the Starmer visit to the White House, Trump kind of pushed back from that, so I think that's unlikely. The critical one is the continued willingness of the Americans to supply Ukraine with arms to defend themselves. That's the minimum I think the Ukrainians will be willing to accept a ceasefire, the minimum. If they're not going to be able to get the weapons to defend themselves, it's game over. Russia will invade again, and he will take the whole country without a shadow of a doubt, right? So the Iranians are not stupid; they know this. I mean, the mood music will be kind of nice between Zelensky and Trump, and Zelensky will be trying to big up Trump, and Trump will be kind of messaging this is a wonderful deal and all that kind of gig. But in the end, it's about what is the US going to do to ensure Ukraine's security? The minerals deal is not enough.
Well, Tim Ash, thank you very much for speaking with us today on the Trump Report.
My pleasure.